Vladimir Putin's Easter ceasefire lasted exactly 0 minutes. Just what exactly was Putin trying to achieve with a fictional ceasefire? And how do we know that the Russians are still on the offensive? We're going to talk about that, plus the bizarre number of firings at the Pentagon, and more importantly, the extension of the nuclear umbrella to Poland looks like it's kind of in doubt. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this, I think, is simply the map of combat actions taken by Russia in the last 24 hours. And as you can see, there's a lot of red, right? Including 6 hours ago, the literal Russian Ministry of Defense made a claim that it occupied the village of Novomykhailivka in Donetsk. Now, this is noteworthy because, frankly, Novomykhailivka, right? The optics of announcing that you've seized a village 12 hours after your supreme leader declared a unilateral ceasefire is insane. Because even if the Russians were to claim, oh, well, the Ukrainians violated it, the Ukrainians are violating it, and we Russians are merely defending ourselves, that flies in the face of you retaking villages or taking villages. I think this is actually not a contested, this was held by Ukraine. So the idea that the Russian forces are on the offensive, brazenly on the offensive, in violation of Putin's order. Now, do you really think that the entire Russian army across the entire front line unilaterally and to a man decided to defy Vladimir Putin, the man who pushes people out of windows? No, dude, no. They were under orders to not stop offensive operations, and the Russian diplomats are just going to continue to song and dance their way to try to convince the Americans that, no, this was just an accident. There was just a miscommunication, just like the last ceasefire where Russia continued energy strikes, but they said, well, actually, we're still negotiating. There's still an agreement to be made between us and the Ukrainians. We weren't sure which targets were and were not allowed to be hit, right? And this entire thing is a farce. And the fact that the administration continues to entertain it as though it is absolutely insane. And you could see dozens and dozens of attacks. In fact, when you look at the deep state map, you can see Russian forces making advances yesterday in Bilohorivka. Let's see if we can find everything here. Oh, you can always count on my internet. But you can see them making advances in Bilohorivka, Rozelov, and Uspakiva. So again, all small areas, but most importantly, these are signs of continued Russian offensive efforts. And so I think the takeaway here, and one other note, is that I actually checked in on this with one of my contacts in the Ukrainian military who's on the front lines. And I was like, listen, is this real or is this just Russian nonsense? Is the fighting happening in your sector right now? And he was like, it is continuing business as usual. Nothing is different or unique. This is purely performative. The Russians have not stopped their offensive operations one iota. And so, yeah, again, this story is to me confirmed, right? Again, this isn't something that was fed by high levels of the Ukrainian armed forces or some sort of trick. Again, guys on the ground, low level officers, company level officers, vetted to me at least that this is still going on, right? Russian FPV drones still attacking. Remember, 6 p.m. on April 19th was when it was supposed to happen. Obviously, things have just continued apace. Of course, on April 20th, right, this morning, Ukrainian General Staff reporting 45 attacks across the front line. Right, that's a pretty standard level of fighting. So, again, continued artillery, continued rocket strikes, continued drone strikes. It's obvious that this was just another Russian trick. In fact, here's Russian forces targeting Ukrainian volunteers doing civilian evacuations with FPV drones during that Eastern ceasefire. There's literally footage of it. So we can't show it, obviously. But again, this is... it's obvious to everyone on the globe that Russia can't be trusted. Remember, last video, we looked up an article in which, in the days leading up to the invasion, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov literally said publicly, Russia has no intention of invasion. We have no plans of invading Ukraine. There is no invasion that's going to happen. This is just NATO and Western posturing. And this is just par for the course. All right. This is just so incredibly normal for the Russians that the problem is that if you've ever played a diplomacy game, like when I was a kid, I used to play Civilization 2. And when you were a kid, you realize that you could actually trick your opponents. You could get them to agree to a peace treaty, and then you got to rebuild your forces and launch a surprise attack. And you could do it again and again to your opponent. But by the third time, your opponent would not accept any peace treaty. They would simply reject it out of hand. They would say a peace treaty with you is worth nothing. And at some point in the international community, the problem is that there's a new player in the seat every 4 years in the United States. And so they continue to believe that the history of betrayals by Russia are simply miscommunications, are simply confusion, right? Oh, I didn't know you meant don't launch an attack on a sovereign neighboring country. Oh my gosh, I feel so silly, right? That's literally what every incoming administration believes. And they think the other one is just knuckle dragging Neanderthals who just maybe forgot to hire Russian translators or something, right? And every 4 years, a new person sits in the player's seat and tries to believes in this Russian that Russian words carry meaningful weight, right? And that Russian promises are anything other than propaganda moves meant to obscure and hide the truth. And because the truth is that we've seen Russia can be responded to, it can be contained, but it responds to force, it responds to incentive. Powerful carrots and powerful sticks. That is the only way to deal with someone like this. And the fact that they think that feel-good negotiations can do that is insane. Now, before we talk about the nuclear umbrella extension to Poland and why that looks to be disturbingly in doubt, plus the bizarre series of firings in the Department of Defense, I want to mention two things. The first is that if you're like me, right, you're a guy, you got kids, you got a house, you got a full-time job. I run a business and I make all these videos. It's hard, but you know what? There's just some subset of people that still believe they can achieve great things. They can still get stuff done, right? I just 2 weeks ago ran an Ironman 70.3 race, and boy, it was hard, and boy, I was not fast, but it took me hours and hours of training in the mornings, over my lunch break, at night after the kids had gone to bed. It's hard. And if you're the kind of guy that understands why we do those things, why we want to do that, well, I made Strike Gum for you guys, right? It is an entire energy drink in every piece. Right? So you don't have to go to the grocery store, drop $5 on an Amp Energy or a Red Bull. Instead, you can get 0 sugar, 90 milligrams caffeine, 100 milligrams alpha GPC, chew it, and you're going to feel it within 10 or 15 minutes at most. And you're going to get the surge of energy you need to lock in and get it done. And you know why we do it, right? If you know, you know. So if you're part of that team, if you're that kind of guy, head over to Strike Gum. Best of all, by the way, we got our Easter sale. You're like, Paul, there's no like banner or whatever. That's because there's no promo code. The sale just happens. You just put any order over $25 in your cart, and you'll get the automatic 20% discount. That's it, right? It's just, we're literally just making the gum cheaper for Easter, okay? So check it out, strikegum.com. Plus, if you want to do something, a good work for Easter, if you want to do something nice, you could support the Ukrainians because we are so close, guys. We are so close to our largest fundraiser ever, right? We had, as discussed, an anonymous Dutch donor who said, listen, every dollar that the American public puts up, I'll match it up to $250,000. He thought, this is ridiculous. They're never going to match that. They're never going to match that. It's never going to happen. It would mean that they would have to raise twice as much money as their next most successful fundraiser. Well, guess what, guys? We are almost there. And this is going, what we're raising is huge. You saw, we already had our first tranche of combat drones, ground logistics drones sent 2 units that need them, right? These are advanced logistics drones that can autonomously move supplies to and from the front line. The most dangerous act in the entire war, getting that last mile, that last 3 to 5 kilometers to the front. That process can be automated with Ukrainian combat drones that we've raised, plus night vision devices, thermal coats, everything that keeps these guys safe on the front lines. That's what we're getting for them. And by the way, this is so important to Fundraiser that the GUR's Artan unit, this is, by the way, the elite combat unit of the Ukrainian version of the CIA. This is like the CIA Special Activities Division. They're putting up some patches for you guys that donate. Just $250 actually. On a $400 donation, gets you 2 of them, one from the GRU and one from Artan. So, dude, you'd be crazy not to. Plus, it's tax deductible for us Americans. So, get yourself some strike gum for Easter and then do something nice for somebody else. The link to both is in the description. So definitely don't wait. Just do it, man. Okay. JD Vance. God bless him. God bless him. Now, one of the things that we've heard, it was actually an interview with a former, basically head of kind of Trump's Russia policy in his first term, Fiona Hill. She said that Trump is terrified of nuclear weapons. He is terrified of Russia and China as nuclear states, and he fears military escalation. Now, here's the problem with that. We all agree nuclear war bad. Everybody agrees to that. But the problem is that what you can't, there is a nuclear deterrent requires a level of spine, right? Because if you admit that nuclear war is so terrifying, you want to only retreat from it. What that does is provides your opponent a trump card. And so it's called sometimes nuclear diplomacy or nuclear saber rattling. And Putin was very fond of it in the first year to 2 years of the Ukraine war. And he would often simply say, even the most trivial things, he would obliquely threaten nuclear attacks. He'd say, if NATO countries support Ukraine, the Russian nuclear forces, we are ready. And then he would say, if you give F-16s to the Ukrainians, new Russian nuclear forces are always on standby to defend Russia. You notice that his statements would never actually say the core idea of, if you do this, we will nuke you, right? Because that's not what he means. But he'll say things like, if you give them cluster munitions, if the Ukrainians get cluster munitions, the Russian nuclear forces will be at their highest level of readiness. Guys, nuclear forces are always at their highest level of readiness. That's how a nuclear deterrent works. It's always ready to launch at any time. And so Russia has shown a willingness to bully frequently. It use its nuclear arsenal as a bullying tactic. And the problem is that Trump is spineless and actually gives into the bullying. So Poland has said, listen, NATO, you guys have said that you're unwilling to defend us as NATO's easternmost country, even though by treaty you are required to defend Poland with nuclear weapons if necessary. And so they said, we'd really like it if you station some nuclear weapons here in Poland, right? We are a far cry from the emerging post-Soviet state with weak institutions that we were in the year 2000. In 25 years, Poland has become as developed and as economically prosperous as almost any other Western European country. In many ways, they are a Western European country at this point, with a robust democracy, a commitment to human rights, a strong and effective military, institutions that are difficult, if impossible, to corrupt. And the Poles have said, listen, I think you should station some nuclear weapons here, just like you stationed some of them in Germany during the Cold War. And JD Vance has said, absolutely not. He says, quote, I haven't talked to the president about that particular issue, but I would be shocked if he was supportive of nuclear weapons extending further east into Europe. He continued, we have to be careful. We are playing literally with the lives of future human civilization. This is one of the most important reasons why President Trump sees himself and in fact is a peace president. Vance said the Biden administration's approach to handling the Russia-Ukraine war was in this instance, that cooler heads need to prevail. Now, what's worth noting is there's an important detail, is that Russia demonstrated that its nuclear saber-rattling was also not credible, because those things did happen and Putin did not launch nuclear weapons. And the problem, the fundamental problem, is that Putin understands that nuclear weapons exist as defensive tools. They are for the defense of the Russian Federation's sovereign territory, just like U.S. nuclear weapons are for the defense of NATO members' territory. And the fact is that his statements are largely lies. We know this because we provided Ukraine with F-16s. We provided them with cluster munitions. We, in fact, permitted U.S. weapons to strike into Russia, right? And these weren't decisions that were made willy-nilly. They weren't made randomly. We gave Ukraine cluster munitions because Russia had deployed cluster munitions. We gave the Ukrainians F-16s because Russia was deploying massive drone strikes against Ukrainian territory, and F-16s were effective at shooting them down. We allowed U.S. artillery strikes or U.S. weapons to strike into Russian sovereign territory because Russia had literally massed invasion forces inside Russian territory, just literally a few meters, a few hundred meters from the border, knowing full well they could mass forces and conduct these invasion operations, that the Ukrainians would be powerless to strike them. And so Russia always demonstrated that it would dare the United States to engage in these. If Russia was really interested in de-escalation, it would understand that playing these sort of games can escalate the conflict. But the problem is that Putin wants the conflict to escalate because he believes the more it escalates, the more he can win. And because he chooses the time and place of escalation. And so the problem is that Putin is not irrational. He is a smart guy. And in fact, when the U.S. or the Russians believed they received intelligence that the Ukrainians or American-backed forces or Americans were going to do something that truly was beyond the pale, there was a mechanism, a separate mechanism that wasn't public statements. The Russians were willing to call the U.S. Secretary of Defense and say, listen, our intelligence said that we think you guys are going to plan to do X, and we want you to know that this is actually beyond the pale. This isn't just empty talk. Really, do not do X, right? And it's unclear what X was. Intelligence is a messy business. My suspicion was that it was probably something like a rumor of a dirty bomb, a rumor of a true terror attack against civilians. And, the Secretary of Defense, when he released his transcript of the call, he said, we reassured them that this was not happening. And we actually publicly turned around and told the Ukrainians, listen, I don't know if you guys are planning this, but don't. We won't back you up for this. So the point is that there are two channels. There is the Russian public statements, which are brazen fucking lies and absolutely unable to be trusted in any meaningful way. And then there's ways for the Russians to actually raise their hand and say, hey, this is a real nuclear escalation. And so the fact that Vance doesn't understand this, that he thinks that Biden actually did engage in some kind of nuclear brinkmanship, is completely absurd, right? Russia, no matter how the Ukraine war goes for Russia, the Russian Federation will not cease to exist. The Ukrainians cannot and will not strike into Moscow. They will not charge. The only forces that have tried to take Moscow in this entire conflict have been the Russian armed forces. Wagner Group was the only force trying to destroy the Russian government. So the takeaway here is that this is kind of a misread and some cowardice by the administration. In fact, it would be a good idea for the administration to express their frustration with Vladimir Putin, to say, listen, Putin, we've repeatedly given you on-ramps to peace. We've offered you tremendous good faith efforts with withdrawing any possibility of Ukrainian NATO membership. We've withdrawn some of our troops from the Baltics. We've done all these things to show that we are sincere about our peace efforts. And in turn, you, Vladimir Putin, have fucked us. You've given up nothing. You've persisted in your war. You've been sincere about zero aspects of your ceasefire. And now we are going to have to do this non-escalatory escalation. Again, U.S. nuclear weapons already protect Poland. It is symbolic to station them in Poland. All it does is send a message to Vladimir Putin that if you thought that maybe you could like squeeze a little bit of Poland here and there, or maybe you doubted the American commitment to defend all NATO allies, like does all really mean all? This sends a symbolic message that yes, all means all. It's pretty severe. It'd be pretty like strong. It'd be pretty, it'd reflect a strong spine. But that's not something the administration is able to have with Russia. And in part, I want to just drop this here before we talk about the DoD firings. So I'll talk about this little Fox News gaffe, an accident. For reasons I don't really fully understand, Fox News broadcasted the Holy Saturday Night Liturgy in Moscow, Russia. Now, and it also adds that President Putin attended an Easter service. Of course, they're also live streaming from St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, and also the Easter service in Kiev, Russia. What an accident. Now, the reason this is so upsetting is that this isn't just like a typo. It's not like they said Kiev, Azerbaijan. It's not like they said Kiev, Nigeria, right? They said Kiev, Russia. And the problem is that one of Vladimir Putin's core claims, his core reasons for invading Ukraine, stated in interviews with former Fox News journalist Tucker Carlson, was that Ukraine is rightfully a part of Russia, that the Ukrainians' ideas about an independent state, a distinct culture, the Ukrainians as their own people, is all lies. It's all nonsense. Putin's position is that the Ukrainians are rightfully subordinate to Moscow, that Russians and ethnic Russians are the superior people of Eurasia, and that it's only right and natural for the Ukrainians to be under their boot. And so calling Kiev Russia is validating Putin's worldview, right? And so again, it's not like a random gaffe, because clearly they knew where St. Peter's Basilica is in the country of Vatican City, which is its own independent country. Don't know if you knew that. So how do you miss this one, right? So again, it's a pretty brazen gaffe by Fox News. Now, I wanted to talk about one other story that I found kind of bizarre, and that is 3 top DOD officials who have been purged in what they say is a leak probe, right? Now, the DOD, you guys might recall, 400 million news cycles ago, actually added an Atlantic journalist to a Signal group chat on Yemen bombing. Now, thankfully, the Atlantic and the journalist have this thing that some people suffer from called patriotism, in which they actually discussed in great detail pending strikes on the Yemeni Houthis. And in order to prevent either the strikes from being ineffective, or worse, an American pilot from being shot down, captured, or killed, the journalist didn't actually leak the plans. But that still reflects a terrible stance towards operational security. And it was the Secretary of Defense himself who added the journalist to the group chat. So this is pretty embarrassing for the administration. But as they've said, the administration said, oh, there were no war plans discussed. That was found to be a lie, because obviously the journalist then shared the distinct war plans down to the strikes, individual packages, specific targets, and exact times. If the who, what, where, when, and why isn't a war plan, guys, then boy, I should sue the U.S. Army for training me in failing to train me in what a war plan is, because boy, that sure sounded like a plan. And the fact is that in a very kind of Russian way, right? And we've covered Putin's kind of internal politicking, and oftentimes when the Russian government and Vladimir Putin make a failure, right? For example, the failure of The failure of the Russian state to contain inflation is a classic one. Oftentimes what they do is they will find a scapegoat. They will choose a scapegoat and they will investigate and fire them for the things that were obviously done by Vladimir Putin, right? Look no further than the head of the Russian central bank, Elvira Nabiullina, who is currently facing an audit of the Russian central bank's actions over the last 2 years because she has failed to contain interest rates. Now, the irony is, of course, that Vladimir Putin ordered her to not increase interest rates to curb inflation beyond 21% because Russian oligarchs and businessmen find it impossible to get a loan to sustain their businesses at that rate. And so that is sort of the Putinist playbook, right? When you fail, you blame subordinates and you punish those subordinates for made up crimes that are vaguely related, right, to the actual issue at hand. And the only reason to do this is to assuage really the public, the ignorant public, and to send a message, but it also sends a message to other senior people. Hey, don't run afoul of the boss. Now, the Pentagon seems to be operating in a similar way because there is ostensibly a probe into internal leaks at the department, saying, quote, recent disclosures of national security information involving sensitive communications with principals, the Office of the Secretary of Defense. This is literally the principals' working group chat, demand immediate and thorough investigation, right? 3 people familiar with the matter said that Deputy Chief of Staff Darren Selnick, Hegseth's top advisors Dan Caldwell and Colin Carroll are being fired and placed on leave. Now, this investigation was so perfunctory and insane that actually Selnick and Carroll are going to sue for wrongful termination. Carroll has not actually been fired, but is placed on administrative leave amid an ongoing internal leak probe. Now, remember, this is literally, they said, the probe is about the principals, and the group chat was called the PC Houthi Strikes group chat, the principals chat. So it's pretty obvious. Now, here's an official statement by the 3 fired officials. They say, quote, we are incredibly disappointed by the manner in which our service at the DoD ended. Unnamed Pentagon officials have slandered our character with baseless attacks on our way out the door. All 3 of us served our country honorably in uniform. For 2 of us, this included deployments to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Based on our collective service, we understand the importance of information security and work every day to protect it, right? Now, the thing that's kind of insane, they continue in their joint statement. At this time, we still have not been told exactly what we were investigated for, if there is an active investigation, or if there was even a real investigation of leaks to begin with. They add, in classic Trumpian fashion, while this experience has been unconscionable, we remain supportive of the Trump-Vance administration's mission to make the Pentagon great again and achieve peace through strength. We hope in the future to support these efforts in different capacities. Right? And of course, the Pentagon spokesman has said, for too long, instances of unauthorized disclosures of national security information have gone uninvestigated at the DoD. SecDef is committed to aggressively pursuing parties responsible for any leaks and will refer them to law enforcement for criminal prosecution. Now, here's the thing that is so weird and troubling about that, is that the fact is that if you're going to have a probe of a leak, there's sort of 2 directions you can do it. One, there's simply a probe to try to understand how information got out. To do that, you almost always have to interview the principals, the individuals who may be responsible. Because it's like when they talk about the White House plumbers trying to discern who was leaking. To do an investigation properly, you talk to everyone. Why? Because more often than not, you can learn things about what has happened. So, for example, let's say you talk to one individual, you're like, hey, where were you at this time? Or what was your intention? Because maybe somebody says, oh, well, we have, literally, let's say you have somebody dead to rights. You have to say, here's an email from your official account to a journalist, right, in which you disclose national security information. Then you could still sit there and say, actually, you still should interview that person, because they could sit there and say, I was instructed to do this by the Secretary of Defense. This was actually authorized. I have it in writing. Let me show you. They could say, guys, this isn't my email, or I don't have control of this email. Or say things like, I was on vacation at this time. I was on leave. I wasn't at my desk. Someone may have hacked this. This may be a Photoshop. This may be fakes. This may have been done by someone else impersonating me, right? We know that the Russians are committed to hacking into systems, sensitive government systems, wherever they can. So all of these things warrant a real investigation. If nothing else, you always want to talk to the person, even if you have them dead to rights. You don't want to fire them, because then you're outing them. If they really have criminally leaked information, you want to interview them, because sometimes people will self-incriminate. So what you want to do is arrest them, file charges, and then interview them in a law enforcement capacity, right? So the fact that they were fired instead of charged says that they don't, whatever they did doesn't rise to the level of criminal action. And the fact that they weren't even interviewed about a leak probe says that the probe is not really all that complete. And so all this taken collectively, we can infer that the actual intention is cover your ass. It's actually just meant to symbolically try to hide the guilt of this epic failure behind some officials. And then it's also meant to, performatively perform for other people that, yes, the Pentagon takes leaks seriously. I sort of suspect, because one of the members was actually the designated point person for the Houthi strikes. I think what they may try to do, what they may be trying to do, is gin up this thing that says, well, technically, because the Secretary of Defense designated you as his principal in this group chat, and you didn't look up every member of the group chat, that technically you said these things, you are responsible for the communications that happened, or were responsible for vetting the members of the group chat, ignoring the fact that Pete Hegseth himself dropped all of that information, all of that key information about the strikes in the chat himself. So, and the fact is that the information security failure was not adding a journalist to the group chat. The information security failure was using a non-secure transmission method, right? Even if there were no, even if there was no sharing of, adding of a journalist to the group chat, it would still be unauthorized, because it was connected to devices that simply are connected to the general Wi-Fi, the general area, right? Someone could have had on that same phone, they could have had a dating app. They could have had a sketchy, they could have had any app on earth on those phones, because they're just normie phones, right? Obviously, right? Even the journalist himself, who the hell knows what apps a rando journalist has on there? So even if he didn't want to leak it, they may have said, again, you download one sketchy Russian app. We've all done it. We've all downloaded an app and gone, this thing's a sketch fest, and deleted it. But the problem is, we're not planning high-level Pentagon operations. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you so much. Thanks to Bill Collier, Robin Coburn, Guys Martin, Gina Cresta, Chris Gortz, Francis Karis, L90, Petra Road, Jalen Gow. I appreciate everything you guys do, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Cheers.